Long before Hearst Castle crowned the hills of California, like a dream carved in stone, there was only distance, wind, and a sense of inherited destiny pressing quietly on one man's shoulders. High above the Pacific coast, where fog drifts inland and the land folds into itself with ancient indifference, William Randolph Hearst imagined not merely a home, but a statement that would outlast headlines, governments, and even memory itself. To understand Hearst Castle, one must first understand that it was never intended to be just architecture. It was conceived as a refuge from the world that Hearst himself had helped to shape, and eventually, from the loneliness that power could not cure. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863 into privilege so immense that it shaped his expectations before it shaped his character. His father, George Hearst, was a self-made mining magnate and U.S. senator, a man whose fortune emerged from the earth itself during the brutal optimism of the American West. Wealth in the Hearst family was not abstract. It was physical, measurable, extracted through risk and domination of land. From an early age, William absorbed the lesson that ambition was not merely acceptable, it was a responsibility. Yet unlike his father, whose power came from industry and politics, William's ambitions gravitated toward influence of a more elusive kind: narrative, attention, and belief. Educated at Harvard, Hearst was exposed to elite intellectual culture, but he never fully embraced its restraint. He was restless, theatrical, deeply emotional, and increasingly convinced that the written word could shape reality itself. When he inherited control of the San Francisco Examiner in 1887, he did not simply run a newspaper, he transformed it into a weapon. Sensational headlines, emotionally charged stories, and a relentless focus on scandal and spectacle allowed Hearst to dominate public attention. His newspapers did not merely report events, they framed them, amplified them, and at times distorted them to serve a broader vision of influence. By the turn of the 20th century, Hearst presided over a media empire unprecedented in scale. Newspapers, magazines, wire services, and later radio outlets placed him at the center of American public life. He was admired, feared, and often resented. Politicians courted him. Presidents worried about him. Critics accused him of eroding journalistic integrity, while supporters saw him as a populist voice challenging entrenched elites. Yet beneath the surface of this empire lay a growing contradiction. The more power Hearst accumulated, the more isolated he became within it. His public voice was thunderous, but his private world narrowed. It was during this period of consolidation and inner tension that the idea of Hearst Castle truly began to take form. The land itself had been part of his family's holdings since the late 19th century, a vast ranch near San Simon, once used for cattle and known primarily for its remoteness. For Hearst, this isolation was not a drawback but an invitation. The site reminded him of childhood summers spent riding horses, disconnected from urban expectations, watched over by his mother, Phoebe "a Person" Hearst, whose influence on his life cannot be overstated. Phoebe Hearst was more than a benefactor, she was a moral compass and an aesthetic guide. A philanthropist deeply invested in education, archaeology, and classical culture, she introduced her son to European art, architecture, and the idea that wealth could and should be transformed into cultural legacy. Their travels through Europe exposed William to cathedrals, palaces, monasteries, and ruins that carried the weight of centuries. These were not merely buildings, they were vessels of memory and authority. Long after Phoebe's death in 1919, her sensibility haunted Hearst's ambitions. Hearst Castle would become, in many ways, a monument to her influence as much as to his own ego. In 1919, the same year his mother passed away, Hearst formally began the transformation of the San Simon Ranch into what he initially described with deceptive modesty as something comfortable. He commissioned architect Julia Morgan, one of the first prominent female architects in the United States, and a woman whose technical brilliance matched her discretion. Morgan was uniquely capable of translating Hearst's sprawling, often contradictory desires into physical form. Their collaboration would last nearly 3 decades, evolving from a private estate into one of the most expensive and complex residential construction projects in American history. From the outset, Hearst Castle defied coherence. It was not built according to a single architectural style, or completed master plan. Instead, it grew organically, absorbing influences from Spanish Baroque churches, Italian Renaissance palazzi, Moorish details, and medieval European fragments. Hearst purchased entire ceilings, fireplaces, doors, and tapestries from Europe, shipping them across the Atlantic to be embedded within new walls. This was not historical preservation, it was historical extraction. The past was disassembled and reassembled to serve a modern American magnate's vision of permanence. Yet even as the estate expanded, Hearst himself grew increasingly withdrawn. Publicly, he continued to exert influence through his media holdings and political campaigns, including a failed run for governor of New York. Privately, he retreated into routines defined by control, nostalgia, and ritual. San Simon became a stage where celebrities, politicians, and intellectuals were invited to perform sociability, even as Hearst remained emotionally distant, observing rather than participating fully. The castle was full of people, yet it was never truly alive in the way communal spaces are meant to be. Hearst Castle, rising slowly above the California hills, was both a triumph and a warning. It demonstrated what limitless resources could achieve when guided by obsession rather than resolution. Each new wing, each imported artifact, each fountain and terrace added another layer to a structure that promised legacy, but quietly accumulated solitude. By the early 1920s, the castle had already become something more than a home and less than a sanctuary. It was a mirror reflecting Hearst's inner world, vast, meticulously curated, and increasingly disconnected from the society that had made it possible. As construction continued year after year, often without a clear endpoint, Hearst's empire outside the gates began to show early signs of strain. The same sensationalism that had built his influence was becoming more controversial. Rivals adapted his techniques. Public tastes shifted. The world beyond San Simon was changing faster than the castle could rise. Hearst responded not by simplifying, but by doubling down on architecture, on acquisition, on control. The castle was no longer just a personal dream, it was a defensive structure against irrelevance, mortality, and loss. In this first phase of Hearst Castle's existence, its foundations were laid not only in concrete and stone, but in unresolved grief, inherited expectations, and a profound fear of impermanence. The hilltop estate stood isolated by design, elevated above the world it sought to outlast. And yet, even as it grew more magnificent, it carried within it the seeds of decline, because no empire, whether built of ink or marble, can remain untouched by the passage of time. By the mid-1920s, Hearst Castle had crossed a subtle but irreversible threshold. It was no longer merely under construction, it had become a living performance, a place where power was displayed not through command, but through invitation. San Simon transformed into one of the most extraordinary social theaters of the interwar period, a mountaintop world where Hollywood royalty, political figures, industrialists, and cultural icons gathered beneath Mediterranean towers, while the Pacific rolled endlessly below. To the outside world, this was the height of American grandeur. To Hearst himself, it was something far more fragile, a carefully orchestrated illusion of connection. Guests arrived by train, car, or private aircraft, ascending the winding roads toward a skyline that seemed impossibly European for rural California. What they encountered was not warmth, but awe. The Neptune pool gleamed like a relic from antiquity. The refectories echoed with conversations beneath imported ceilings centuries older than the nation hosting them. Every detail was designed to overwhelm. Yet beneath the spectacle lay rigid control. Guests followed strict schedules. Dinner conversations were formal, often subdued. Hearst presided not as a convivial host, but as a distant sovereign, observing reactions to the world he had assembled piece by piece. Central to this world was Marion Davies, the actress who became Hearst's long-term companion and emotional anchor. Their relationship, though deeply personal, unfolded within the shadow of public scrutiny and moral compromise. Hearst never divorced his wife, Millicent Wilson, and Davies existed in a liminal space neither fully acknowledged nor truly hidden. At San Simon she was both muse and mediator, using humor and warmth to soften the edges of Hearst's severity. Guests often remembered Davies as the true heart of the castle, the one who laughed easily and made others feel momentarily at ease. Yet even her presence could not dissolve the structural loneliness embedded in the estate itself. The castle's social life masked deeper anxieties. Hearst's media empire, once ascendant and unchallenged, faced mounting pressure. Competition intensified. Advertising markets fluctuated. Critics increasingly blamed sensational journalism for political polarization and public distrust. Hearst, who had once thrived on controversy, now found himself defending a legacy that felt less secure with each passing year. The castle grew even as confidence shrank. Construction continued relentlessly: new guest houses, expanded terraces, refined interiors, yet the project never reached completion. There was always another improvement to be made, another artifact to acquire, another refinement to pursue. This endless construction was not merely architectural indecision, it was psychological resistance to finality. To finish Hearst Castle would have meant declaring the vision complete, and completion implied closure. Hearst resisted closure in all its forms. He resisted aging, resisted diminishing relevance, resisted the idea that even the grandest creation must eventually stand without its creator's guidance. As long as the castle remained unfinished, it remained alive, evolving alongside his sense of self. Yet the world outside San Simon was changing rapidly. The Great Depression struck with devastating force, reshaping American society and exposing the vulnerabilities of unchecked wealth. While Hearst Castle continued to host lavish gatherings, public perception hardened. Extravagance became suspect. Excess turned from admiration to indictment. Newspapers once owned by Hearst now faced declining revenues, forcing painful cutbacks. Properties were sold. Staff reduced. The financial engine that had fueled both the media empire and the castle began to sputter. Inside the estate, the contrast between magnificence and anxiety grew sharper. The same halls that once symbolized triumph now echoed with unease. Hearst, increasingly frail and cautious, spent more time secluded in private rooms. The architectural emphasis shifted further inward: hidden corridors, private theaters, secluded dining spaces. The castle, once designed to impress, began to fold in on itself. It no longer reached outward toward the world, it retreated, mirroring Hearst's own withdrawal from public life. Despite its isolation, San Simon could not escape the pressures of history. Political movements challenged concentrated power. Labor unrest questioned the legitimacy of industrial fortunes. Media itself was transforming, with radio and emerging technologies eroding the dominance of print. Hearst, once a master of modernity, found himself defending structures both institutional and architectural rooted increasingly in the past. His castle, assembled from fragments of European history, now symbolized a kind of temporal displacement. It belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. By the late 1930s, the gap between appearance and reality had become impossible to ignore. Hearst Castle still dazzled visitors, but it no longer convinced them. The spectacle remained intact, yet belief had faded. What had once been read as vision now looked like fixation. What had once seemed eternal now felt oddly suspended, as if the entire complex were holding its breath against an inevitable reckoning. Hearst himself sensed this shift, though he rarely articulated it openly. Power had given him reach, but not peace. Influence had brought attention, but not intimacy. The castle stood as proof that architecture could preserve memory, but not meaning. It could hold objects, host events, and command silence, but it could not protect its creator from the quiet erosion of relevance and certainty. As the world moved closer to global conflict, Hearst Castle remained perched above the coastline, magnificent and unresolved. It had achieved everything it was designed to display, yet failed at what it most quietly sought: permanence through belonging. In its golden rooms and shadowed corridors, the contradiction of Hearst's life reached full expression. He had built an empire of voices, yet ended surrounded by echoes. The unraveling of William Randolph Hearst's world did not arrive with a single catastrophic moment. There was no dramatic fall, no public reckoning equal to the scale of his earlier ascent. Instead, decline came slowly, almost politely, disguised as adjustment. Hearst Castle did not close its gates. The towers did not crumble. The Neptune pool still reflected the sky with undiminished elegance. Yet beneath this outward continuity, the forces that had sustained both the man and the monument were quietly dissolving. By the early 1940s, Hearst's physical health had begun to fail in ways he could no longer ignore. A series of strokes weakened his mobility and clouded his once formidable command of detail. The man who had personally reviewed headlines, layouts, architectural sketches, and art acquisitions now relied increasingly on intermediaries. Decision-making slowed. Control softened. For an empire built on relentless oversight, this loss of personal command was existential. Hearst had always equated presence with power. Without presence, the machinery he had designed began to drift. The Second World War accelerated changes that had already been underway. Wartime austerity made overt luxury untenable, and Saint-Simon's elaborate hospitality effectively ended. Guest lists dwindled. Staff numbers were sharply reduced. Construction halted almost entirely. What had once been a site of constant activity, stonecutters, carpenters, artisans refining spaces that were never quite finished, fell into an unfamiliar stillness. Hearst Castle entered a new phase of existence, not abandonment, but suspension. This pause revealed something profound. The castle had never been designed to function independently. Unlike traditional aristocratic estates that evolved across generations, Saint-Simon was inseparable from a single will. Its logic was personal, not institutional. Without Hearst's constant intervention, there was no guiding principle to determine what came next. Rooms remained unfinished not because of neglect, but because no one else possessed the authority to decide they were complete. The estate became a physical manifestation of unresolved intention. Financial realities grew increasingly unforgiving. Hearst's debt, accumulated through decades of aggressive expansion, now collided with declining revenues. Trustees and advisors were forced to impose discipline that Hearst himself had long resisted. Assets were sold. Control over newspapers shifted. The empire contracted not in disgrace, but in resignation. Hearst, once the architect of American mass media, became a symbol of an earlier era still respected, but no longer defining the future. Throughout this period, Marion Davies remained by his side, her role evolving from companion to caretaker. Their life together grew quieter, more inward. The grand dinners and theatrical gatherings of earlier decades were replaced by routine and constraint. Davies, who had once animated the castle with warmth, now inhabited it as a private refuge rather than a social stage. Saint-Simon ceased to perform. It endured. In 1947, Hearst left the castle for the final time, departing for medical treatment with the expectation, perhaps the hope, that he would return. He never did. The mountain retreat that had defined his vision of permanence became something he could only remember. When he died in 1951, the castle remained exactly as he had left it, magnificent, incomplete, and strangely untouched by the passage of time. There was no successor prepared to inhabit it as he had. No heir could replicate the singular psychology that had brought it into being. In the years that followed, Hearst Castle faced a question that all monuments eventually confront: what is its purpose once belief has faded? The answer came not from ambition, but from pragmatism. In 1957, the Hearst Corporation donated the estate to the state of California. The transformation was subtle but decisive. Saint-Simon shifted from private dream to public artifact. It became something to be interpreted rather than lived within. As a historic site, the castle acquired a new kind of legitimacy. Visitors marveled at its scale, its craftsmanship, its improbable existence on a remote hilltop. Guides explained its origins, its collections, its contradictions. Yet what could not be fully conveyed was the psychological intensity that had shaped it. The way each corridor reflected a need for control, each vista an assertion of relevance, each unfinished space a refusal to let the story end. Hearst Castle survived because it adapted, but that adaptation came at the cost of its original meaning. It no longer projected power. It preserved memory. The silence that once would have unnerved Hearst now defined the site. The absence of the man who had animated every stone became its most eloquent feature. What remained was not a palace in the European sense, nor a purely American monument, but a hybrid, part museum, part mausoleum, part unresolved confession. The story of Hearst Castle is not ultimately about excess, nor even about failure. It is about scale without succession, vision without continuity. Hearst had understood how to build institutions that dominated a moment, but not how to ensure they evolved beyond him. His castle stands as evidence that permanence cannot be manufactured through magnitude alone. Without renewal, grandeur becomes stillness. Without belief, spectacle becomes shell. Seen from a distance, San Simon still appears timeless, rising above the coastline as if detached from history. Up close, its meaning is more fragile. It is the record of a man who tried to outbuild time, who believed that stone, art, and visibility could substitute for inheritance and stability. The castle did not collapse because it never needed to. It simply outlived the conditions that had made it necessary. In that survival lies its quiet tragedy. Hearst Castle endures, but it does so emptied of the urgency that created it. It remains a monument to ambition, yes, but also to the limits of ambition when it is pursued in isolation. The loneliness that haunted Hearst's final years did not destroy his creation. It defined it. In the decades since Hearst Castle passed into public stewardship, its meaning has continued to evolve in ways William Randolph Hearst could never have fully anticipated. The estate, once conceived as a living extension of his will, has become an object of contemplation rather than command. Its endurance has transformed it from a personal instrument of power into a collective mirror, one that reflects not only the life of its creator, but the cultural moment that produced him. To walk through San Simon today is to encounter ambition preserved in amber. The rooms remain lavish, yet curiously restrained by absence. Beds are neatly made, tables set as if awaiting guests who will never arrive. Artworks gathered from centuries and continents still line the walls, but they no longer function as declarations of authority. Instead, they read as evidence proof of a hunger that could never be fully satisfied. The castle no longer speaks in the voice of command, it whispers in the language of accumulation. This transformation invites a reevaluation of Hearst himself. For much of the 20th century, he was caricatured as either a villainous press baron or a romantic eccentric undone by excess. Both interpretations flatten a far more complex figure. Hearst was neither mad nor purely malicious. He was a product of a transitional age, straddling old-world aristocratic ideals and modern mass democracy, attempting to reconcile inherited fantasies of nobility with the volatile realities of American capitalism. Hearst Castle was the site where that reconciliation was attempted and ultimately failed. Unlike European palaces, which emerged gradually from dynastic continuity, San Simon had no past to anchor it beyond Hearst's imagination. Its antiquity was imported, its traditions staged, its permanence asserted rather than inherited. In this sense, the castle reveals a distinctly American anxiety, the fear that without history, power must be constantly performed to feel real. Hearst understood instinctively that visibility creates legitimacy. What he underestimated was how exhausting that performance would become once belief eroded. The loneliness that marked Hearst's final years was not merely personal. It was structural. His empire had been built around a singular personality, and when that personality weakened, the system could not adapt gracefully. There were institutions, but no rituals that survived him. There was wealth, but no shared mythology strong enough to carry it forward. Hearst Castle stands as a lesson in the difference between building something impressive and building something sustainable. Yet to dismiss the castle as a failure would be too simple. Its survival as a public site suggests another form of success, one measured not in dominance, but in resonance. Millions of visitors have passed through its gates, not to witness power in action, but to study its aftermath. In doing so, the castle has acquired a second life, one rooted in education, preservation, and reflection. What was once private spectacle has become public memory. This shift reframes Hearst's legacy in quieter terms. He did not succeed in creating a dynasty that endured politically or culturally on his terms. But he did leave behind a structure that continues to provoke questions about ambition, identity, and the cost of excess. Hearst Castle endures not because it solved those questions, but because it embodies them so completely. In the end, San Simon was never truly about comfort, nor even about beauty. It was about reassurance, the attempt to fix meaning in stone, to make power visible and therefore permanent. History proved otherwise. Power moved on, media evolved, belief fractured. What remained was architecture without an audience, grandeur without urgency, and yet, standing above the Pacific, the castle still commands attention. Not because it rules, but because it remembers. It reminds us that ambition, when pursued without succession or shared purpose, tends to circle inward. It reminds us that monuments can survive their creators, but not their intentions. And it reminds us that the most enduring legacy of unchecked power is not collapse, but silence. Hearst Castle does not accuse. It does not apologize. It simply remains an unfinished sentence written in stone, waiting for each generation to decide what it means. By the early 20th century, William Randolph Hearst no longer needed marble or gold to demonstrate his power. His true palace was invisible, constructed not of stone but of ink, headlines, and mass emotion. Through an expanding network of newspapers stretching from New York to San Francisco, Hearst commanded one of the most influential media empires the modern world had yet seen. His papers did not merely report events, they shaped reality, selecting which truths were amplified and which were buried beneath sensational spectacle. In an era before radio and television, print was power, and Hearst held it with unprecedented reach. This power altered Hearst's relationship to the world around him. Where San Simon had once been imagined as a gathering place for equals, artists, politicians, thinkers, it increasingly became a backdrop to a man who no longer trusted conversation as much as circulation numbers. Hearst's newspapers offered certainty, control, and immediate validation. Human relationships, by contrast, were unpredictable and resistant to mastery. Gradually, the balance shifted. The more influence Hearst wielded publicly, the more distant he became privately. The Spanish-American War marked a turning point, both for Hearst's legacy and for American media itself. His paper's aggressive coverage of Cuba, saturated with emotional language and graphic imagery, helped inflame public sentiment against Spain. Whether Hearst caused the war remains a subject of debate, but what is undeniable is that his journalism demonstrated the terrifying efficiency with which mass opinion could be mobilized. The lesson was not lost on him. Power, Hearst learned, did not require presence. It required narrative dominance. This realization followed him back to San Simon. The castle expanded even as its social core hollowed out. Hearst hosted guests, but the gatherings increasingly felt ceremonial rather than intimate. Writers, actors, and politicians arrived knowing they were entering a carefully controlled environment, lavish, generous, but subtly surveilled. Conversations unfolded beneath ceilings that testified to wealth beyond imagination, yet genuine vulnerability was rare. Hearst listened more than he spoke, observing as he always had, but now with the detachment of a publisher reviewing copy, rather than a man seeking connection. Politically, Hearst's ambitions faltered where his media empire thrived. His attempts to win elected office, including runs for mayor of New York and governor of New York State, failed despite his immense visibility. The rejection was deeply personal. For a man accustomed to shaping public opinion, electoral defeat revealed a painful truth. Influence did not guarantee affection, and power did not translate automatically into trust. The newspapers could command attention, but they could not compel loyalty in the voting booth. As the decades passed, Hearst's world narrowed. The castle remained active, but the rhythm changed. Fewer guests stayed as long. Fewer evenings stretched into philosophical debate. Marion Davies remained his constant companion, yet even this relationship unfolded under the shadow of public scrutiny and professional compromise. Hearst's insistence on promoting Davies' film career through his influence in Hollywood created resentment rather than admiration, further isolating both of them socially. The irony was profound. Hearst had built the ultimate instrument of communication, yet found himself increasingly unable to communicate authentically. His voice reached millions, but his inner life grew quieter. San Simon, with its endless rooms and echoing corridors, reflected this contradiction perfectly. It was a place designed for abundance, but it increasingly bore the emotional weight of absence. The final years of William Randolph Hearst unfolded not with scandal or spectacle, but with a slow, almost imperceptible contraction. The man who had once reshaped American media, who had built a castle to defy time and geography, now faced an adversary he could neither outright nor outspend reality itself. The Great Depression exposed the fragility beneath even the most expansive empires. Advertising revenue collapsed, circulation declined, and the financial machinery that had sustained Hearst's newspapers for decades began to grind under its own weight. San Simon, conceived as a monument to permanence, became a liability. Its sheer scale demanded constant maintenance, staffing, and repair. The fountain still flowed, the art still adorned the walls, but the cost of sustaining illusion grew unbearable. Hearst was forced to sell assets, artworks, properties, entire newspaper holdings, pieces of the very world he had spent a lifetime assembling. Each sale was a quiet admission that immortality had always been conditional. By the late 1930s and 1940s, Hearst's physical presence at the castle diminished. Health problems confined him, and the castle increasingly functioned without its creator. Rooms once animated by conversation fell silent. The architecture remained unchanged, but its meaning shifted. What had once symbolized ambition now suggested excess. What had once represented mastery now spoke of overreach. San Simon no longer projected power outward. It reflected inward, becoming a mirror of a life nearing its end. Marianne Davies stayed by Hearst's side as his world narrowed. Their relationship, often mischaracterized by gossip, endured beyond relevance and reputation. Yet even this constancy could not restore what had been lost. Hearst's empire survived in fragments, reorganized under trustees and creditors, stripped of personal vision that had driven it. The newspapers continued to print, but the voice behind them softened, losing the sharp authority that had once defined an era. Hearst died in 1951, not in his castle, but far from it. San Simon outlived him, preserved not as a living residence, but as a historical artifact. The state of California assumed ownership, transforming the private world of one man into a public destination. Visitors now walk through rooms once reserved for the most powerful figures of the 20th century, absorbing beauty without bearing its cost. The castle remains breathtaking, yet its silence tells a story no less important than its splendor. Hearst Castle endures because it captures a universal contradiction. It proves that wealth can build monuments, but not meaning, that power can command attention, but not intimacy, that ambition can reshape landscapes, but not outrun consequence. The castle was never unfinished because Hearst failed. It was unfinished because no human vision, however vast, can ever be complete. In the end, San Simon stands not as a celebration of success, nor as a cautionary tale of hubris alone, but as a reminder of limits. Every empire, whether built of stone, paper, or influence, exists within time. And time, indifferent to ambition, always collects its debt. If this story resonated with you, if the rise and quiet unraveling of Hearst's empire made you reflect on power, legacy, or the hidden cost of ambition, then this channel is built for you. These are not stories of villains or heroes, but of human beings shaping the world and being shaped by it in return. Consider subscribing if you want more deeply researched, cinematic histories of old money dynasties, lost empires, and architectural monuments that reveal more than they conceal. And share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you see Hearst Castle as a triumph, a tragedy, or something in between? Your perspective becomes part of the conversation and part of the history we continue to explore together.